podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to Humans of Speedway. I'm Ian Brannan, and in this episode we're going to be celebrating some of the real unsung heroes of the sport, the track staff. Before we get into that, though, I just want to share a little message with you that I received from one of our listeners called Al Priddy. Hi to Al. Now, Al has been working his way through the back catalogue of Humans of Speedway while driving around New Zealand, particularly on a long drive to Wellington. He's checked out Jeremy Doncaster, Gary Havelock and Shane Parker, and he shared a Shane Parker story with us, which I'm sure that Shane Parker wouldn't mind us sharing. You'll hear why. Shane Parker, says Al, used to live 5 minutes from my parents' house, and he had the street name near his house. Anyway, not long after Shane Parker left the street name disappeared. Mystery surrounded it. Then I was looking through Shane Parker's pictures on Facebook, and what do I see in his garage in Australia? Yep, the missing street name. Only Shane Parker would do something like that. I'm sure it's in pride of place. Thanks for getting in touch, Al. If you'd like to get in touch, you can follow us on our Facebook feed, and you can send us a message through there. Just look for Humans of Speedway. We've got a new group, actually, as well. You can join in that as well. And also on Twitter, we are at Speedway Humans. It'd be great to hear from you and give you a mention in the next episode. On to this episode, then, all about what goes on behind door number 96 at Swindon's Abbey Stadium. Now, number 96 is a little bit of a bolt hole for the track staff at Swindon, and one of those track staff is called Graham Cooke. Now, if you used to read a website called the Blunsdon Blog a few years ago, Graham was the man behind that, detailing the everyday goings-on of the track staff at Blunsdon, all the stuff they get up to. Now, he's been involved with the Swindon track team for quite some time, and he's going to give us an insight into the work that goes on to prepare a track. As you'll hear, it's more than just shoveling shale around. There's a real science into what goes on in preparing these tracks. And beyond that as well, Graham is also one of the Swindon track staff who make the journey every year to Cardiff for the British Speedway Grand Prix. Graham is actually one of the guys who opens the pit gate, so he's been heavily involved in some iconic incidents that have happened at the British Grand Prix, and he's also heavily involved in dismantling the track after the event, long after you've gone home, when you're either in a nightclub or tucked up in bed. We will hear all about Graham's experiences. He's also going to design his dream meeting on Speedway Paradise at the end. It just leaves me to say a very warm welcome to Humans of Speedway, Graham Cooke.
Hello.
It's great to have you here, and often when I'm explaining what Humans of Speedway is about, it is about people like you. You know, this podcast, while we talk to star riders, and I love doing that as well, the idea of this podcast was to shine a light on the people that without which we would have no sport, and without a speedway track we would definitely be struggling. And I think a lot of people are looking forward to hearing about some of the work that goes in and the nuances of how you prepare a great racetrack, and of course your time working with the track at Cardiff and so on as well. But before we get into that, and there is a lot to get into, let's start at the beginning for you then. Where did your love affair with speedway begin?
Well, I didn't have much choice with the sport really, because my mother was a Wembley Lions fan going right the way back to the 1930s, and my father was a New Cross supporter. So I was taken to my first world final in sort of about the age of 2, and again, a very early age, saw a number of speedway meetings, and it just became part of life really. My early heroes were Peter Craven and Ove Fundin, and I remember having rosettes in the days when there were rosettes with their names and their photographs on. So speedway's always been, part of my life. And when I was a child, when we moved from London up to the West Midlands, my dad and I started going to Wolverhampton, to Monmore Green, in the days before they had the very large stand there. And the hero there was one Ollie Olsen, who was very much the number one there. And it's been an enormous delight that in latter years, through working at Cardiff for the Grand Prix, that I've got to know Ollie really well. And it's been a super chap. had a bit of a break from Speedway at college and university time, but then in 1983, living not far from Swindon, happened to hear a radio broadcast saying, well, it's the start of the Speedway season at Swindon this evening. And I thought, yeah, let's get back into it. So I introduced my wife to the delights of the Swindon Robins, and we started going along, and it all came back to me, and I've been a fervent fan ever since. But I've been very, very fortunate in that I've had time now to be able to indulge myself more than just being a fan, to actually get involved in the work that goes on behind the scenes.
It's fascinating, I think, the story of the relationship that people have with Speedway, because you hear, I think, more often than not, it's a very similar tale to what you've just told. People are introduced to it as youngsters, they maybe drift away a little while, and then they go back, and it's like they've never been away. It's one of those things that just, like an old friend, really, isn't it, that sticks with you?
It's very much so. I mean, it's an enormously friendly sport. I mean, I've got 2 children. I mean, they're grown up now. But Stephanie, my daughter, I think she attended her first Speedway meeting when she was about 2 months old. David, my son, who's now one of the start marshals at Swindon, I think he was 6 weeks old. And I used to take them along when they were toddlers, and they used to run off, but I never felt any concern. There's never been any trouble. I can hardly remember seeing any members of the police force at Swindon. They certainly weren't needed, and it was a secure environment. And it was a nice sport to get them involved in, because they got to see their heroes, and they got to meet them as well. And it's that kind of close relationship. The sort of, people talk about the kind of the family of Speedway, which attracted me to the sport so much.
And you took your wife along when you rediscovered Speedway. You went along to watch that match with Ipswich, Swindon and Ipswich, wasn't it? I mean, what did she make of it if she's never been before?
I think she was amazed by it. I think she'd seen it on television, the world of sport, when it would crop up between, Dickie Davis introducing, the horse racing and the wrestling occasionally.
Yes, some very exciting stuff. I know that part of the country rather well, and I know that the sport is very popular down there, as you can see with the big crowd that attended.
But she'd never actually been along to see it, and I think that it's the buzz of it, it's the excitement of it. And when I've taken, other people along to Speedway for the first time, they'll often say, I've seen it on telly. But when they actually get there and you stand near the start line and you hear the bikes revving and you can feel that thunder underneath your feet, and then suddenly that explosion of action and power and excitement, it's breathtaking. And, I've yet to take anybody to a Speedway meeting who hasn't come away at the end going, wow, is it like that all the time? So, we were hooked, and it became, every Saturday night, because it was Saturday nights in those times. Every Saturday night we would go off and we would see Swindon, and in 1983 it wasn't exactly the best Swindon team in the world. It was, Phil Crump and several other riders really, and Phil, bless his heart, kept the team together, but they lost far more than they won. But we were hooked. We had our hero, a Danish rider called Alf Busk, who was a reserve, and he used to get some fearful treatment from a section of the crowd not too far away from us. But we kind of felt sorry for Alfie, and every time Alfie scored a point, it was like a goal in a cup final or a 6 in a 2020 match. We were leaping around. We were hooked. It was great.
And making that leap then from being a very avid supporter at various stages in your life to being involved in the club at a greater level and getting involved with the track staff, and how did all that come about where you crossed the fence, as it were?
Well, I had some time on my hand, and I knew Rob Bamford, who's a great Speedway statistician, who also lives in Malmesbury, where I live. And he was working on a book and asked me if I could contribute some data from some of the programmes that I'd kept. And he happened to mention to me that the season was about to start, and he was going to put out an advert looking for volunteers to come along on a Saturday before the start of the Speedway season at Swindon, just to help Gerald Richter, who was the track curator at the time, set up the air fence, etc., etc. So the Saturday was free. So I said to Dave, my son, who was I think 9 at the time, fancy coming along? So he was up for it. So off we trotted. And if my memory serves me right, I spent the entire day lying flat on my back underneath air fence panels, holding the collar of the air fence, whilst Dave held the rubber kickboard and somebody else clipped the kickboard to the air fence. It was fairly exhausting and it was fairly mucky, but we really enjoyed ourselves. And at the end of the day, Gerald, who was the track curator, came across and said, thank you very much. You couldn't come back tomorrow, could you? So I looked at Dave and said, shall we? He was certainly up for it. So we went back on the Sunday, and it was just sort of 5 or 6 of us finishing off various bits. And at the end of the Sunday, Gerald said, well, you're not doing anything on Thursday, are you? And I said, well, nothing that I can't move. And he said, well, come along on Thursday at sort of 8:30 and help us set up for the meeting. And that's how I got to meet Gerald and his number 2, Rod Ford, who's known throughout the Speedway world as Punch. And I got to know Gerald and Punch, and Punch is still one of my best friends. Gerald is still a very close friend after all these years. And we just started working as a threesome, and then gradually it became a foursome, a fivesome, and the daytime track staff took off from there.
It's funny, isn't it, how wheels within wheels sort of leads to things. I mean, what are the biggest surprises that you found now, looking back on since taking over as being a member of track staff, since crossing the fence, the things that you have learnt about Speedway since becoming a member of the track staff that maybe you didn't appreciate to begin with?
I think the biggest surprise is that you never stop learning. I think that the more I learn, the less I know really about track preparation. I think the closest to the Speedway curator's role in sport is the cricket groundsman. And we know about the dark arts of preparing a wicket in cricket. It's 22 yards, it's a grass-based surface that uses the roots of grass to hold the surface together. It's 3 yards wide, and an awful lot of work goes into preparing it. But cricket fans will know that there are bowlers' wickets, there are batsmen's wickets, there are tricky wickets, there are fast, there are slow, etc., etc. I think what I've learned over the years is that Speedway tracks and their curators are very, very similar, except, of course, they are huge in comparison. The sheer amount of work that goes into creating in inverted commas, a good track, a consistent track, is remarkable, and I don't think we've ever stopped learning. In the early days, I was very much the boy who was sort of sent off to go and collect things, make sure a tractor was in the right place, make sure a piece of equipment was in the right place, but for goodness sake, don't touch the track. As time goes on, I've got more used to the sort of the cycle that's concerned. But the Speedway track is a huge area that's constantly changing. It's almost like a life force, really. It changes from day to day, from hour to hour. It can change from minute to minute. And one of the jobs of the track curator, and I've worked with 2 brilliant track curators in Gerald Richter and now Ronnie Russell. The job of the track curator is to anticipate how the track is going to evolve, how it's going to develop, and to make sure that any work that's done works with the track rather than working against it.
Now, I think people are going to be surprised as to how much work goes on behind the scenes looking after a speedway track. And we've been chatting on email and so on before we've done this interview. And you've been saying that you're having meetings with the track staff, even though there's no season for Swindon in 2021. And even through the depths of the off-season, you've still been getting together virtually to talk about the track. And were it not for the pandemic, you would have been meeting up at the track on the days that you're allowed in there to do work. Talk us through preparing a speedway surface and the cycle of jobs that are required. If we take it from the end of one meeting to the start of the next, what's the work that goes into preparing that surface?
Right. I mean, basically, we are tenants at the Abbey Stadium, so we have access to the stadium on a Thursday. The rest of the week, the stadium is used for greyhound racing. Occasionally, when there's a BT or a televised meeting, that goes on a Monday, and we have to fit ourselves around the greyhound schedule. But effectively, at the end of a standard Thursday, we try and put the track to bed. So as soon as the riders have done their sort of farewells and have retreated to the changing room or have gone off to a press conference, the track staff get ready. All of the shale is brought back from the kickboards, back from the air fences. We get the tractors out on track. Occasionally we might even get the big blade out, although that's a bit difficult because getting access onto the track through a crowded pit area is quite difficult at Swindon. But we'll try and relay as much of the track as possible. Occasionally we'll bring out new material because there's a constant need to refresh the material because shale does get tired, and when it gets tired it doesn't bind as well together. It loses its core strength. But we'll actually put the track to bed, we'll smooth it out, flatten it out, and then effectively we have to leave it almost for a week. That's not so bad because the weather will do quite a lot of our work for us. If it rains, I mean, we won't leave the track wide open. It'll be packed down, so it'll be quite firm. But rain throughout the week is no bad thing because rainfall is the best kind of watering that you can possibly get for a speedway track within reason, and it'll be left. It may well be that some remedial work will be done over the weekend, introducing new shale or just smoothing out some areas which have been damaged in some way. And some work will be done by Ronnie and Punch and also Dixie Dean, who used to be the track curator at Newport and who's now joined our team and is a fine addition to the Swindon track staff. They'll do some work on a Wednesday. The Thursday team, myself included, appear at 8:30 on every Thursday morning, except for the Thursday before Christmas and the Thursday after Christmas. So we're there during the season and also during the closed season as well. But on a race day, we'll arrive at 8:30, and that's when the work really starts. Punch, Rod Ford, would have been out watering the track. If it's been very dry during the week, he'll have been out there from sort of 7 o'clock in the morning, beginning to get water into the track. And then Ronnie and Dixie will go about working the track, developing the racing lines, smoothing it out, while the rest of us busy ourselves with air fences and everything else that's required for a speedway meeting.
We hear a lot about watering the track and so on some meetings, perhaps the watering is done too late. Sometimes perhaps it's too early. I guess this is a crucial dark art to how a track behaves. I suspect the watering as to how long and I think probably the surprise is how long you have to water the track for. Yeah,
I mean, shale. I think it's fairly well known that we're finding quite difficult to get hold of decent quality shale. I mean, it used to be a very large byproduct of mining, and it had all sorts of uses in the base for pavements and roads and the like. Nowadays there are alternatives, and therefore shale isn't seen as being an important byproduct anymore, and the mines don't necessarily, and the quarries don't have the facilities to be able to grind the material down to the kind of level that we want. So we're constantly looking for it. But shale itself is it's a chemically active substance, combining sort of hugely compressed clay with softer clay pieces. So basically it's a clay-based surface that we use in the UK, different from the ones that are used in Denmark and Sweden and Poland. This is the kind of material that we have here. And clay needs a moisture content. And watering is very much the dark art. I mean, I think that we've got one of the best exponents of the dark arts at Swindon in Punch, who takes care of nearly all of the watering for us. And what he's trying to achieve, as with every aspect of track preparation, is consistency. It's all about consistency. We want a consistent track on a weekly basis. We need it to be consistent during the meetings so that we get similar times in Heat 15 to the one recorded in Heat 1. We need to get consistency across the width of the track and also down through the top level of the shale down into the base itself. And it's the water that helps the shale and the clay within the shale to bind. So it not only keeps down the dust, but it also makes sure that you've actually got a good, firm, solid surface. If you get it right, then the shale becomes mouldable. You can actually pick it up into your hand, and you'll often see track staff going out onto a track during a meeting, grabbing a handful of shale and compressing it in their hand and then releasing it. Well, you don't want water running out of it, because then that means it's been overwatered. But you actually want it to hold its shape. That means it's right. If it doesn't, if it just falls through your fingers, then the shale is too dry. So too little water on a track and the surface begins to break up. You get dust, you get inconsistency. Where you've got inconsistency, you've got danger, because riders can't predict what's going to happen from metre to metre. You get poor racing, you get poor visibility, and just a general unsatisfactoriness. If you put too much water onto it, because it's clay-based, it becomes slimy and it becomes slippery, so there's no grip for the riders. Once again, you get inconsistency, because they'll go from areas where there's grip to an area where there's no grip, and back again. And once again, they come in covered in shale, they can't see where they're going, the racing is poor. So getting the moisture content absolutely right and keeping it right is vital. You also can't wet an overly dry track quickly, because what you need to be able to do is to get the top layer, which is the racing layer of shale, to bind with the base layer, if you like, the sort of the foundation of the track. If the track is too dry, what happens is you'll water the top surface, and the top surface will be wet, but underneath it will be dry, and the two bits will never actually stick together. So as soon as a rider starts broad sliding, a whole mass of the track will move, and you've got disaster. If you've overwatered the track, it's very difficult to dry it out quickly. I mean, normally what we do, if the track has been affected by rain throughout the day, is you'd fluff up the surface with some small sort of prongs, just to try and get air into that top layer, and then begin to sort of pack it down. And by turning the shale over and over and over, you can begin to dry it out. But there's still doubts about, how much water has got down below, how well it's binding. Some people have talked about using sawdust to try and dry out a wet track, but sawdust works for one meeting, but it completely messes up the shale. You end up with these great big lumps of material which are no use to man the beast. So when we have used sawdust in the past at Swindon, we've literally had to blade the whole lot off before the next meeting and completely relay the track. So what we tend to do is we water often early on a race day and try and keep it even throughout the day. Sometimes we'll even water on the night before, so that the water has a chance to move down into the track before it gets evaporated off by the sun.
Now, the Swindon track underwent major redevelopment, in the 2019 season, right? The 2019 season, which you were involved in, which was quite a lot of work to achieve in a short period of time. You were saying your access to the stadium fairly limited, and the decision to go ahead with the work was at fairly short notice. 2021, of course, there's further work going on around the surroundings at the Abbey Stadium, which is going to mean no action for Swindon Speedway this coming season. But give us an insight into the work that's been ongoing at the Swindon Stadium. There's always been talk of things happening there, but the redevelopment work of the track was pretty major work for you.
Well, almost since I've been working up there, there's been stories, the stadium's first of all, it was going to close. Then there was a furore in the local media and the people of Swindon who said, no, we can't allow this to happen. So then it was going to be a new stadium on a location not far away from the existing one. And then for various reasons that I don't know about, that didn't come about. And then we had houses being built, getting closer and closer. So that, now, some of the people can, you wouldn't want to be putting out your washing in your back garden on a Thursday, put it that way, if you're that close to the pits. So there were lots of stories about making changes to the track, but it was at the end of the 2019 season that we turned up on a Thursday to start taking in the air fence and do the cleaning, removing all the kickboards and replenishing those, and all of the other jobs that we do over the winter. And sorry, it's after the 2018 season, that's right. And some markers had been put out that went partly across the track and partly across the centre green, and then reappeared on the back straight. And that's when we knew that that there were going to be changes, but nothing was confirmed. And those markers stayed there, and then it was 50 days before the first meeting of the season was due to go off that we got confirmation that we were going to have to bring the track in and reduce it from 363 metres down to 320, and actually move all of turn one in on itself. And that was a huge undertaking, and we spent far more days than we probably should have done up there working, recreating the track, putting in new drainage, putting in new lines, building a new safety fence, working with the constructors to make sure that the wall that separated the outer edge of the speedway track from the greyhound track was completed and at the right height and the right kind of conditions. Then bringing in the base foundation material, the hardcore that went down first of all, and then the limestone that went down on top of that to help with drainage, and then the actual shale itself, and then actually widening, using the opportunity to widen the track all the way round. So we actually made the straights and turns 3 and 4 significantly wider than they were before. And it was a real race against time. I mean, there were times when, the rain was pouring down, it was so cold you couldn't feel your fingers, and there we are hanging onto a length of fencing as the wind buffeted us, while, posts were being drilled into the ground and we were attaching them. So, yeah, it was nervous, but it was quite exciting though as well, because you realised that you were in at the start of what could be something really quite exciting. And I think we realised that as the work went on, we were producing something special, a special speedway track. I mean, the old Swindon Speedway track was I think, probably great for when the sport started in the 1940s and in 1949 and during the 50s. But the fact is that the straights were very long, the bends were wide, but they were quite tight. Now we've actually got shorter straights, wider straights, enormous turns 1 and 2, and with the extra work which we did in enormous turns 3 and 4, we created a beast. But even though it was looking all right in shape, there were all sorts of problems which came to fruition on press and practice day, when riders came out and actually tried the track and found that turns 1 and 2, because they were newly laid, were soft. There just wasn't time for the material to bed in. But worse than that, turns 3 and 4 were like concrete, because all of the lorries which had been bringing materials down to turns 1 and 2 had been driving across there for the last 50 odd days and had compacted that down. So riders were struggling to get round 1 and 2 because it was quite deep, and then falling off on 3 and 4 because as soon as they tried to broadslide, the bikes were just sliding away. So we had to delay the start of the season a little bit to do some more remedial work, and so Swindon started off with a series of away meetings. But it didn't take too long until we started seeing some absolutely magical racing, and I think the racing from probably mid-July onwards towards the end of the season was the best speedway racing I've ever seen at Swindon in all the years I've been going up there. And
you're mentioning you've got limited access to the stadium as well. I suppose that you are really kind of in the lap of the weather, because if you turn up one day and the weather is fairly unpredictable, then it doesn't leave you much time to counteract the elements of Mother Nature, does it, before the start of the meeting?
Weather is vital. If you get... we need this consistency all the time. So, I mean, clearly, if you've got a very, very hot day, bright sunshine, and worse than that, bright sunshine and wind, the top surface dries out very, very quickly. So you've got to water more often, but you've got to be aware of what's underneath that top surface, and you don't want that to turn to slime. So Punch is out on the track throughout the day, looking at the shale. He's working with Ronnie and Dixie as well to decide where they're going to be working, what they actually want to do with the shale, where they want to put some added grip. I mean, we do tend to rip the inside of turns 2 and turn 4 just to reward riders who want to try and come back to the white line, give them a little bit of extra drive through. So he will work with them throughout the day. But all the time he's monitoring, he's looking at the possibilities of rain. If it's going to rain, then we have to close the track down a little bit. So we will flatten it out and make it hard so that the water runs straight off, and then we'll try and open it up again after the rain has passed. There's also temperature considerations as well. At the start of the season, at the end of the season, when you get cold evenings, as soon as the temperature drops and as soon as the sun goes down, moisture starts coming up from underneath the base of the track. So what at 7:05 looks the perfect track, at 7:20 looks shiny and icy. And that's a real problem then for us, because we've got to try and ameliorate that moisture, because as soon as a rider hits it, they're sliding off and they're going into the fence. And for people who've been to Swindon, that some of the speeds that riders are achieving are extremely high, and therefore we need to make it as safe as we possibly can. So all the time we've got that. Then there are even more considerations, like the fact that the Swindon track is cambered. So what we have to try and do is to find a way to make sure that the top of the track, the higher points of the track, are as moist as the lower points. Because if we simply just slop water around, the water runs down the camber, so you end up with dry, dusty conditions up near the air fence and a swimming pool down by the white line. So those kind of things also need to be taken into account.
The biggest foe, of course, of Speedway, rain. Have you ever had situations where you've got a perfect track, you're ready to go, and you get that huge deluge just shortly before the match that can often throw everything into chaos? I mean, how do you cope with that kind of situation?
There was one particular day, Swindon were riding against Bellevue. This is when Lee Adams was the master of Blunston, and still probably the most stylish rider that I've ever seen. We'd been working all day. It had been very hot, but by sort of 4 o'clock, clouds started to mass in the west. Now, Swindon track sits atop of Blunsdon Hill, and it has very much a sort of a microclimate. And there have been times when it's been raining in Swindon town centre, it's been raining in Cheltenham, it's been raining in Cirencester and Oxford, but it's as dry as a bone at Swindon, at the track. And we have actually seen times when clouds have come towards Blunsdon Hill and almost biblically moved either side of the track and disappeared off again. But on this one particular day, the clouds began to mass and we were a little bit concerned. And I left the track briefly to pick up my son and my daughter, who my wife had brought them halfway across. And when I left, the track was bathed in sunshine. As we were driving close to the stadium, there was a cloud burst. And by the time we got into the stadium, standing at the top of the pit gates, I couldn't actually see the other end of the track. The rain was so intense. It had passed by about 7:15, but when we went down to the bottom end of the track, and Blunsdon Circuit is sloped, so bends 1 and 2 are the lowest point within the stadium, effectively. When we got down to turns 1 and 2, the main drain that we dug had been washed away almost, and there was water 3/4 of the way up the banking towards the air fence. Well, we'd spent so much time trying to get the track right, and there was a certain importance about getting the meeting on as well because of fixture congestion, that we got our water cart out, which at the time had got the facility to be able to vacuum up water. And during the course of the next hour, and the track staff worked amazingly, we removed 15,000 gallons of water from the speedway track. Now, at 7:30, the referee came down and said, "Come on, lads, let's call it off." And we said, no, please, how long can you go? And he said, "Well, I'll give you until 8 o'clock. There are people in the stands. I'll give you until 8 o'clock. And there were photographs that were taken which show Punch, in fact, standing, and the water's almost up to his knees on the track itself. But we pumped it all off. And at 10 to 8, we got rid of the last water cart of water. And Eric Boocock was the manager of Bellevue, and he came down and he had a look, and he was, "Well, I'm not too sure about this, lads. I think really you ought to admit perhaps that it's beaten you." But we were determined. We were going to get this meeting on if it killed us. Anyway, the riders went out in Heat 1. Lee went out, looked at the track as he always did, and we're now really worried about what it's going to be like. And I have to say, Heat 1 wasn't pretty. Lee gated. The other 3 got filled in fairly quickly, but nevertheless, we knew it would take sort of 4 or 5 races to actually turn the surface over. Anyway, Lee hammers away, wins the race, and Gerald and I are standing at the pit's entrance as Lee comes up, and he's shaking his head from side to side quite vigorously, and our hearts sank. Lee's going to say, "You can't run speedway on that. That's awful, call it off." Anyway, he parked his bike up, and we heard the track announcer announce that in fact Lee Adams had broken the track record at Swindon.
Wow.
So we rather tremulously approached Lee, quite imagining that he would turn around and say, "What on earth did you think you were doing, putting on a track like that for us to race on?" But he turned around and he said, "Well, why were you shaking your head?" He said his bike cut out on the final run through to the line. He could have gone quicker. Now, after sort of 5 heats of fairly mucky racing, the surface was turned over, and we had a great meeting. The Robins won. Eric Boocock came round to our little bolt hole, our little track staff room, which is ubiquitously referred to as number 96, because it has a door to it which has got number 96 written on it, and put his head in and said, "I have to say, lads, I don't know how you managed it, but well done." So it is possible to rescue success from the jaws of disaster, but it doesn't happen all that often.
You're listening to Humans of Speedway. That is the voice of Graham Cooke, who's one of the long-standing members of the track staff at Swindon Speedway and also involved on the main days of the Cardiff Speedway Grand Prix as well. We're going to talk about his experiences at Cardiff very soon. We're talking about speedway tracks and how you get them in good shape, and we've been talking about how you deal with a lot of water on the track. One of the big things, of course, with Speedway is the threat of rain. Track covers are always mentioned when we have a key meeting of why we're not using track covers, and Swindon were involved in checking out various track covers and options like that, and you found that perhaps they caused as many problems as they solved. And what was your experience with track covers, Graham?
When they were first mooted, Terry Russell was heavily involved in, together with Ron, and looking at the possibilities of track covers, and we looked at lots and lots of materials, but in the end, because I think of costs, it was decided that the Speedway promoters would purchase one set of track covers, and the idea is that they would be sent around to tracks when there was a televised meeting to try and ameliorate the effects of a rain-off on the television schedule. Well, these track covers were made up, and when they arrived, they almost filled a container at Blunsdon. The idea was that they would be based at Blunsdon, and they would then be taken off in a lorry and driven to another track. They were so heavy. I mean, unbelievably heavy and difficult to work with. And the first time that we had cause to use them, we got the track staff in on the day before, and we all gathered and we started carrying these things out and laying them out. They were joined together by Velcro, and because they had to be designed to cater for every track, that they were a compromise to every track, so they didn't really fit. So we had lots of folding and folds and bits that didn't fit, and it was like a jigsaw without the picture on the box, except it was enormous. Well, we spent, I think, about 5 hours putting out these covers. And of course, we were realising that if you put a plastic sheet down on your lawn and the sun comes out, if you pick it up after a couple of hours, there's an enormous amount of moisture underneath it, which has been drawn up. So we couldn't actually prepare the track. We had to lay these things on a bone-dry track in the hope that effectively they wouldn't start drawing up and we wouldn't end up with something like a meringue underneath the covers when we removed them. I mean, the trouble was that when we went back the following day and then spent an equal amount of time removing the covers, water had got under them, because at Swindon, the Greyhound track is at least higher, or at least the same level or higher than the Speedway track, and water was actually coming down through the Greyhound track underneath the fence and underneath the covers. And of course, all of this water that was raining down on the covers was running off, and rather than being absorbed into the track evenly, had now formed a huge lake down on turn one. So we're pulling back the covers, and we've got, in equal amounts, areas that are slimy, so slimy you could barely walk on them because they were that slippery, and areas which were absolutely bone dry. Now, trying to prepare a track then from that kind of base was almost impossible, added to the fact that we were all so tired that I'm not saying, I think actually somebody was physically ill at the end of removing all of these covers, and then they all had to be cleaned, and then they all had to be put back in the bags again. It was a huge task. Now, if you're in Sweden or Denmark, let's take Vojens for example. Vojens is a one-use stadium. Ollie Olsen and his team have access to that racing track every day of the week, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So if he wants to put down covers, he can do it, it's much smaller than Swindon anyway. He's got bespoke covers, and there's a track staff that are there who can do that throughout the week. But where you've got shared stadium, as we've got at Swindon, and as is the case in most tracks across the country, you just can't do that. You haven't got that time, and you haven't got the manpower, the person power to actually put those sheets down, make sure that they're secured, and then take them up again. Even if you forget about the problem about, do we prepare the track before we cover it, or do we cover it and then try and prepare the track? So, yeah, covers, they're a nice idea. They work on a cricket ground. They work on a cricket square, because you just fire up the hovercraft, pull it across the outfield at Lord's, put it over the sacred 22 yards, and off you go, basically. It keeps the moisture off. But you can't do that with a speedway track. It's just not possible.
Speedway tracks, I'm learning, are a lot more complicated than they look, and you forget how much moisture is in them, and they need to breathe, like all of us. Let's turn our attention to something else that you might be well known for. You were behind a website which talked about all the adventures of people who were involved in track staff and curating the tracks and all this kind of thing, called the Blunsdon blog. Now, you started this off, and it really kind of got going and was pretty big in the speedway world at one point. And tell us a story behind your website and your experiences of being a bit of a speedway writer, really.
Yeah, I'd always been interested in writing anyway, and I'd always found writing really quite straightforward. It wasn't an arduous task, and I'd also spent quite a long time working in education on on computers and information technology. And it was at the end of my first year of working with Gerald and Punch that a friend of mine, who's now a member of the track staff, ironically, came up to me and said, well, that's the end of the season. What are you going to be doing on a Thursday? And I said, well, I'm still going to be going up on a Thursday. Yeah, but there's nothing to do. You won't have to do anything until March, will you? And I'm thinking, well, that's not my understanding of it. So after our first non-speedway season Thursday up at the track, I thought, I'll write something, and we'll just put it up on a blog somewhere. So we came up with the name, the Blunsdon blog, and I wrote this slightly tongue-in-cheek account of what we'd done and what it was like, and put it up, and people started responding to it. And I did one for the following week. And again, we've got more comments coming in, and comments of, can we have some photographs as well so we can see what you're doing? So it grew and it grew. We used a website, or part of a website that was being used by a friend of mine, Neil Wise from Tattinger Marsh, who were sponsors of Swindon Speedway for a time. We used a bit of his website, and then we branched out with blunsdonblog.co.uk. And it's a little bit like the Archers, I suppose. It was a sort of weekly tale of track staff. And we tried to keep it light. There were some bits that I couldn't put in for all sorts of reasons. But we tried to keep it light. And what I wanted to do was, I was so in awe of people like Gerald, Punch, Ron, and the other guys, Mike Hunt, who is the clerk of the course at Swindon, who's also the clerk of the course at Cardiff, the Grand Prix. People like this who've been working up at the Speedway for so long, for so many years, given up so much of their time for the sport. I just wanted, to show people, who these people were. And so the blog grew, and it was quite fun writing it on a Sunday, and it came out every week, and it ran for about 9 years. It spawned 3 books, The Year of the Blog, Abbey Road and The Abbey Habit, which all sold quite well and continue to sell as well through online bookstores. And yeah, it was fun. I decided in the end to knock it on the head. I mean, at one stage we were, we were getting huge figures of people, reading it, 25, 30,000, 35,000 people a week. And doing searches, I found that, there were people in Peru who were reading it on a weekly basis. And I'm thinking, what on earth will they be making of this? I know we had quite a fan base, if that's the right word for it, in Australia. And we also had lots and lots of Scandinavian readers, because at the same time we were also pushing the Team Holta GB in our fascination and fandom of Rune Holta, which remains to this day. But yes, it was great fun. After a time, I decided that I was in danger of repeating myself, running out of jokes, and so we just decided to let it quietly die. But a lot of people wouldn't let it die, and I still get people who say, "No, you're not the Blunsdon blog bloke, are you?" And I go, Well, yes.
Yeah, I might be.
Sorry.
Recognised again.
Yeah.
It's funny you should say that, actually. I have a listener to this podcast in Peru. I don't know who it is, but I know that there is one.
They may well be the fan of the blog. You never know. I mean,
in which case, this is going to be a great day for them.
Absolutely, yes.
Looking at the, you mentioned there Cardiff and the Swindon track staff being involved in that, obviously a key fixture in the whole international speedway calendar, the British Grand Prix at Cardiff, so unique in its surroundings and one of those temporary tracks that often cause a lot of debate, but I think less so in the latter years. Tell us about how you got involved in that and what your role is on that, because I think it's it is an iconic speedway fixture of the modern times, really, isn't it, to be involved with? Yeah,
I mean, it all started. I mean, again, it's through Terry Russell. He was responsible for the Grand Prix before it came to Cardiff, and he was responsible for pushing the idea of using Cardiff as a Grand Prix centre in 2001. And it was agreed at the time that the track staff during the day would be made up of partly of the Newport track staff, because they were the local Welsh club, but also Terry's track staff from Swindon. So I went along, I think, for the first 4 or 5 Grand Prix, purely as a fan. But when I got involved with Swindon, I was asked if I'd like to go to Cardiff, and said, but of course, absolutely. So for the first few years, we were working with the Newport track staff, but then, very sadly, Newport closed down. So it then became the Swindon track staff, because effectively we were working with the sport on a weekly basis. People knew what the jobs were, knew how to do them, and we formed pretty much the same team for about the last 10 or 11 years at Cardiff. And I mean, the whole Cardiff experience starts on the Thursday night at Blunsdon, because we normally had a meeting immediately before the Grand Prix, and we do our normal Thursday work, put the track to bed, go home. Following morning, a group of us would go off to Cardiff for the Friday, arriving down in Cardiff at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and we work throughout the weekend down at Cardiff, and it's enormous fun. It's hard work. It's exhausting, but it's exhilarating, and we've made some wonderful friends over the years. Don't see much of the racing, but I do make sure that it's always recorded on the Skybox, so that I can watch it in the week that follows. But effectively, we provide the support. Mike Hunt, who's the clerk of the course at Swindon, is the clerk of the course at the Cardiff Grand Prix. Andrew Reynolds, who's the assistant clerk of the course alongside myself at Swindon, and the pits marshal, he's the assistant clerk of the course. So, they're very busy in themselves. I mean, the rest of us man the gates around the track. There are 3 entrances to the track. There's one for individuals down by the start gate. There's an entrance on turn 4 where all of the track equipment is stored and comes onto the track and they use it. And then there, of course, is the pit gate at the Dragon's Mouth in the stadium, where the riders come out onto the track. And over the years, we've all developed our own expertise. And the last, I think, 6 or 7 years now, I've felt enormously privileged to have been working with, my son Dave on the pit gate. And effectively, our job, there are three of us: Edwin Hutchinson, who's another one of the start marshals at Swindon, and Rex Woodruff, and myself and Dave work on the pit gate. We make sure that it's manned throughout the weekend, all the way through Friday, all the way through Saturday, to make sure that only people who come onto the track have got their right accreditation at the right time. We liaise with Ollie and Hans Danielsen from Arkell, who are the Danish company who actually install the track. We liaise with them about what can be done and what can't be allowed onto the track, etc. We make sure that somebody's there all the time. We interact with members of the public who come up and sort of ask about the track, how many tons and how many lorry loads and when does the work start, etc., etc. And then we're involved in the extreme high pressure of practice. The practice on the Friday afternoon is far harder work than ever the Grand Prix is on a Saturday. It's absolutely manic, but it makes sure that we've got our skills absolutely honed, so that pit gate gets opened so fast and is always ready and available should there be an incident. And then from the early years of going there, we got to know the lads from Arkell, the Danish team, who are an absolutely superb bunch of chaps. And we said, can we do anything to help at the end of the meeting? And they said, well, if you want to hang around, then yes, you can help us take it all apart. So for the last 10 years, a small group of us have stayed on once all of the air fences have been taken down and all the banners have been removed. And we work right the way through until sort of 4 or 5 o'clock Sunday morning, dismantling the superstructure of the track with the Arkell lads. So it does mean that Sunday, there's no point in trying to hold a conversation with me because I'm completely out of it. But nevertheless, it's just a wonderful buzz. And there are kind of magic moments at sort of 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning when you're standing in the middle of the Millennium Stadium and you just see something which has had 40-odd thousand people 12 hours before. There's now 15 of you in there. And everything's been dismantled. It's a brilliant experience.
Yeah, an eerie experience almost as well, I imagine. And working on the pit gate, there's a lot of focus around that. Obviously, you're letting the riders on and off the track. There must be quite a few stories that you've had over the years, some notable experiences. What would those be when you think of them?
We've had a couple of them. I'm embarrassed to say that I was part of the infamous Emil Seyfedinov Scott Nichols fight at the pit gate.
Blimey, that's a fairly decent story, Graham. If you're involved in one of the most iconic moments of British Grand Prix Speedway history.
They did a feature this year. They got the two of them together in the studio to talk it through, and I had a word with Emil afterwards. At that time, that's when I was working with two of the Newport lads on the pit gate, and my job, once the gate had been opened, was to push the air fence open and stand by the end of the air fence, the open air fence panel, and then shepherd the riders through and then down the tunnel. So the race finished, the riders went past, we opened up the gate, I went up, stood by the end of the air fence panel, and I could see that there was some pointing and pushing, and then the pushing became a bit of shoving.
He's just shrugging him off. Seyfedinov won't let it go.
And then I realised they were actually coming towards me, so I thought, right, get out of the way. So I went and stood with my back to the main part of the air fence panel, away from where this went on. They collided with each other by the pit gate.
Right into the pit gate. It's all kicking off here. Unbelievable stuff. Look at this. I can't believe it. So puts it off from Nichols, losing it completely. Well, seconds out, round 2.
People started erupting from through the pit gate because you could see what was going to happen. And as I moved forward, we've now found out that it was Emil, swung his foot, the one with the steel shoe on it, and it connected right on my ankle bone, which brought me short fairly quickly. Two of the Newport lads then managed to get between them, and between us we managed to get them down through the pit gate. It wasn't then helped by somebody who then barged into Scott Nichols, and then Scott came back for a second lot.
Oh, reaction from the team from Cyferton. That is out of order.
I'd learnt a little bit from that experience, so that when I think it was Nicky Pedersen and Hans Andersen had a coming together, a couple of Grand Prix later, I got well out of the way. Let them get on with it. They'll sort that out. But yeah, I mean that there have been some interesting moments because, as with all aspects of the sport, these are very high pressurised moments. The riders are hyped up, their mechanics are hyped up. You can't expect people to be reasonable and rational at moments like that. All you can try and do is diffuse any situation that you think is beginning to brew, and make sure that everything appears as calm as it can be.
With your track staff hat on, though, looking at the Cardiff racing surface, obviously it is a temporary track installed and removed from the stadium in the course of a week. Ollie Olsen and his team are behind that. You have a bit of an insight into how they do it. Just sort of tell us and explain to us the sort of work that goes on to create that world-class racing surface that we see when we have the Speedway Grand Prix at Cardiff.
It's down to the material, and it's probably down to the way that the Danish crew lay it down. It's put down in layers. A layer of shale goes down, then it's watered and it's compacted and bladed. Then another layer of shale goes down, it's watered, it's compacted, it's bladed. And gradually throughout the week they build it up until they get to the level on the Thursday where the track is completed. So I think the most surprising thing that we still find every year is, as we're dismantling the superstructure, which is made up of these large sort of concrete shuttering boards that are all locked together, we start unlocking them and craning them away. When you get down to the lowest level, where the shale is up against the boards, when you remove them there, the moisture level throughout probably a metre's worth of shale is exactly the same at the top as it is at the bottom. There's no dry area at all. The whole thing works together, because where you've got that kind of moisture content, you've got the consistency, and that's the consistency that we're always searching for in Speedway. On a permanent track, I can tell you, under the base layer, the foundation that we've got for the Speedway track at Swindon, because its shale has been compacted and compacted and compacted and watered and compacted and dried and compacted, it's like rock. It is rock hard. So you've always got an incredibly hard surface with the racing surface on the top of it. But at Cardiff, it's all the racing surface. It's really quite a magical substance. They take great care with it. I mean, every year when we're packing away, a chap comes out and drills holes at various parts around the track and takes samples away with him. And those are then, they measure the moisture content, they measure the average particle size so they can see how much of the track has been broken down, and that then helps them to determine how much new material needs to be added for the following year. But it really is quite unlike any other Speedway track that I've ever been to.
When you look back on your time in Speedway, Graham, and obviously being involved much more than most fans are, both at Swindon and at Cardiff, what are the great memories and the high points that you take with you from those experiences?
I suppose if we take Cardiff, I think everybody who knows me knows that I'm a Rune Holta fan. Three of us went out to Sweden at the invitation of the late and the much lamented Lee Richardson back in 2007. And we attended a meeting at Vetlanda where Rico was riding on our first night in this week of travelling around, which culminated with the Grand Prix at Melilla. And we were made to feel like sort of royalty. You know, we were friends of Lee's, we were Lee's guests, we were wined, we were dined. Every time a plate was empty, it was refilled. Every time a glass of beer was empty, it was refilled. Everybody stopped and chatted. We were Lee's friends, and they were desperate that we should go away with a good impression. And it was the most wonderful evening. But they were up against Ross Begana. Jason Crump was number 1 for Vetlanda, and Greg Hancock was number 1 for Ross Begana. Vetlanda won the meeting, but it was tied on bonus points. And the three of us, Neil Wise, Phil Rice and myself, it was all sending out Jason, weren't they, obviously, and Jason Crump will obviously come out against Greg Hancock. Oh no, the captain of Vetlanda was Rune Holta. Mr. Holta will come out, and Rune came out and beat Greg Hancock. Was treated almost like a deity, really, at Vetlanda. And we found out a couple of days later, sitting in our hotel in Vetlanda, about to go off. I think we were going to Lejonen, to Gislaved, to watch one of their meetings. And who should walk into the breakfast area but Rune Holta? So the three of us sort of sat there in awe, and do we chat to him? No, we better not. Better not disturb him. He's obviously far too important. So we're eating our meal, and this voice comes across with, "Hello, lads. Are you from England?" And we realised that it was Rune. And he turned out to be the friendliest, nicest bloke that we could possibly meet, and we kept on bumping into him, and he arranged for us to meet up with his mechanics and his team and be his guest while he was setting up the bikes. We had the Rune Holta hats and all this kind of stuff, and it was brilliant. So I came back, I wrote a blog and said, we've met up with one of the nicest speedway riders you could possibly meet, and he was very, very popular with everybody that he met. Lee Adams spoke very highly of him. Rico thought he was absolutely a great bloke, but of course we'd never seen him apart from that one occasion a year when he'd appear at the Grand Prix, and he was very much sort of a mystery because he never rode in the UK. And the following year, at Cardiff, I was walking down the area where the pits is, and I heard this voice calling, "Hello, my friend," and turned round, and it's Rune. And it was a case of, when you've got a spare moment, come and have a cup of tea with the lads. So I went and met Christoph and Michael, who were his two mechanics. And I introduced him to all the Swindon lads, and he shook hands with everybody. He had posed for photographs, and it was absolutely brilliant. And it started a sort of relationship with him that then developed so that the following year, on the Thursday night at Swindon before the Grand Prix, I suddenly heard my name being called about 6:30, and was told, you can't imagine who's just pulled into the pits car park, but Rune Holta's van has arrived. And sure enough, Rune's there with Michael and Christoph, and they'd been reading the blog and keeping up to date with what had been going on. And then Richard Crowley, who's the announcer at Swindon, came up to me and said, "You don't think I could interview Rune on the centre green? You couldn't bring him out, could you?" So I said to Rune, I said, "Would you mind being interviewed?" And he said, "Well, why would they want to interview me? Nobody knows me here." Well, clearly quite a lot of people have been reading the blog over the previous year, because we walked down to the centre green, and the applause that he got was astonishing. He was completely taken aback, and he spoke very glowingly about it on the next few occasions when we met him. And all of the years that he competed until he dropped out of the Grand Prix, every year Dave, Steffi and myself would always go around for a cup of coffee with the boys. We went out to Voyens, to see him in 2011. You know, we had our Norwegian flag and our Team Holta GB T-shirts and all that kind of stuff. So it was really great, to get to know him. So that will always be one of the high spots. The Chris Harris winning the Grand Prix, that was a mighty night. But then they've all been, pretty special. I suppose spending time and working with, Phil Morris and especially with Ollie Olsen and his son Torben has been, extremely rewarding. And in my time at Swindon, the highlight is just working with the track team, because they are special people, and they are some of my best friends, and they are people who I admire greatly and who I miss enormously, even though we do have our weekly Zoom catch-up. Thinking about the riders that I've met over time, I was never working on the track when Brian Carger rode for Swindon, but Brian was always my daughter's favourite, and we sponsored him a tyre once and had photographs, and I got to know Brian. So when he came back for the Lee Adams testimonial, we were having a chat. It was really rather nice while I was having a chat with Brian and his wife, his son Peter had come across and was doing some meetings in the UK, and he was chatting with my son Dave in the pits, and that was a special sort of moment. You can't take away the memories of the last meeting at Swindon, of course. Who would have known that on that night when we were celebrating winning the 2019 championship, that would be the last meeting that we'd see at Swindon for, it will be sort of 2 years. But what a night that was, just tremendous celebrations, and what a team, and what racing on the new Blunsdon circuit, which had certainly been challenging to all of us during the early parts of 2019, when we had to make the changes that were required by the alterations to the stadium. So I've met lots and lots of really, really nice people in Speedway, and I wouldn't have swapped it for anything.
This is Humans of Speedway. I'm in conversation with Graham Cooke, who is part of the track staff and the assistant clerk of the course at Swindon. And it's the Swindon track staff who are involved with the Cardiff track as well. And I put a little post out on social media before we recorded this episode, Graham, for see if people had any questions to ask you about track preparation or tracks in general and things like that. And here are a few questions for you, if that's okay. Tony Rycroft asked a question. I think this is related to Cardiff, really. But what do you know roughly what the cost is of installing or creating a track like that for a one-off event?
I honestly don't. I mean, it must be huge. I don't know where you'd find that kind of information. Jeff Scott might have some information. Jeff seems to be able to unearth all sorts of statistics about Grand Prix. I don't know. I mean, it's a huge undertaking when you see how many people are involved. I mean, we only see it when it's being taken apart, but at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, sort of 4 or 5 hours after the Grand Prix is finished, and you've got the Danish track team of probably about 15 of them. You've got Ollie Olsen's small team of 3 or 4. You've probably got, there's the Swindon 4 as well. You better add us in as well. There's all the guys who are cleaning up the centre green and rolling up the carpets that cover that. You've got the cleaning staff are in cleaning the seats, because the stadium has to be returned back to the stadium owners, clean and tidy by I think it's the Monday after the Grand Prix. So everything has to be gone and everything has to be tidied up, and it's an enormous undertaking. Even if you forget about the 70 odd lorry loads of material that have to come and go, and the transportation of the big blade that they use at Cardiff, that's brought across from Denmark each year. The storage for the shuttering, it's a huge undertaking, and I think what they achieve in effectively, build a track in a week and take it apart, just stunning.
Nathan Thomas says, I'd like to know, if it is possible, regarding banking on temporary tracks. You don't see much of it, and wondering if there is a reason for that.
Because it's a smaller track than some of the huge ones out in Poland, which have more significant banking. It doesn't need so much. I think it also then comes down to the way that the material's actually laid. If you want to get banking in, then you've got to have a well-established foundation, and a well-established foundation can only be created over a significant amount of time, i.e. you put it down flat and then you begin to build up the banking, because it actually holds its shape far better. With the temporary tracks, my understanding is that if they actually made the banking any more than it is, then it would start to become unstable. So rather than being flat and quite smooth, you would actually have movement. So you'd have quite a small depth of track on the inside and a significantly large amount of depth on the outside. I mean, at Cardiff itself, when we take the white line up, which is one of the first jobs we do after the meeting is finished, the shale is probably only about 4 or 5 inches deep on the asphalt floor of the stadium. By the time you get to the outside, it's over 1 metre deep. So I think, if you had it even more than that, then you'd actually have significant differences in the consistency of the material from the inside to the outside, and I think it also might be slightly more unstable. But I'd leave that kind of those kind of calculations up to the boys from Arkle and Ollie and his crew, because they are the experts.
Andy K has been in touch. He says, why do they grade / water a track after every 4 heats? I think, again, particularly in the GPs. And he's sort of saying that sometimes that the racing can seem pretty good, and then they grade and water it, and maybe the track doesn't respond quite as well. I mean, what are the hazards of grading and watering during a meeting?
If you don't grade, then you lose the racing material, which is the material at the top of the track. On a speedway track, you've got your foundation, your base layer, which is often years and years of compacted shale, and then you try and bind some top material, which will allow the rear wheels to spin, but also give them just the right amount of grip. This material inevitably gets moved because the pressures put upon the shale by a spinning rear wheel tyre at that kind of speed going sideways, has to be seen to be believed. I mean, we've looked at rear tyres at Swindon that after 4 heats have been shredded because of the enormous impact and pressure. Now that all goes down into the track, so that material, no matter how well you compact it down, it will get moved. Now if it gets moved off completely, what then happens is that the rear wheels begin to grip the track surface more, but not in a consistent way. So they'll spin in some places and grip in others. And the trouble with the speedway bike is that as soon as the rear tyre begins to grip suddenly, it starts to straighten up. So you get a poor quality of racing, but you also start to get a line of rubber being laid down on the track, which is known throughout the sport as the blue groove. The trouble with the blue groove is that if you do get this line of rubber down on the racing line, the rider who can put their rear tyre on that line of rubber will get so much grip they'll never be caught. So you end up with very, very processional racing, because as soon as anybody moves off the blue groove to try and overtake somebody who's on it, they're into deep material and it's inconsistent material, and then they've got problems with actually controlling the bike. So what we try and do is to bring the material back from the outside and bring it back across the racing line. Now we won't bring all of it back because then you'd have too much of a depth of material. We will water the track to help it bind and also to keep down dust, because that's the other major complaint that we get. If we do get a meeting, and sadly a couple of years ago we had a televised meeting in the middle of one of the hottest spells of summer, when from about 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning there was no water coming into the stadium. All of the taps were dry, and we ended up with a complete dust bowl. Nobody could see anything. The punters went away covered with half of the track. The riders were dissatisfied. The racing was appalling. It was a bad moment. We couldn't help it. It was out of our control, but nevertheless that was the case. So we bring the material back down again to try and replicate. What we want is this idea that the time for heat 1 should be very, very similar to the time for heat 15, so that everybody gets as good a go as possible. Now, with regard to the Grand Prix, of course, they grade every 4 heats. And, I mean, some riders like the idea of drawing number 1. Others hate it. If you draw number 1 in the Grand Prix, you always come out on a freshly graded track. Mm-hmm. There are some riders who will come out nearly always on the final race before there's a grading. And the track is different. So in order to enable all riders to have something as fair as possible, we're constantly trying to bring the track back so that it is consistent across the meeting. But we also know that the watering has to be so careful that even a tractor going round with a water cart behind it, going 2 miles an hour slower than it should do, will put significantly more water on the track and will have a deleterious effect upon the racing.
Question here from Ian Brown, who I assume is not the one from the Stone Roses, but has a question about the type of shale used on the indoor tracks, particularly at Cardiff and I imagine Warsaw as well. Is it different shale that we're using at Cardiff now versus what we would use at, say, Swindon and standard outdoor tracks in the UK?
I think it's a different type of material. It is a finer clay type material that they've got. As I say, I mean, shale was this sort of byproduct of quarrying, and whereas back in even until the last 10 years, you could actually go to a quarry and get shale, which would be milled down to the sort of the 5mm size stone. I think it's 7mm is the maximum size stone, plus the right amount of clay. That was quite easy. Now, because shale is no longer used, it's been replaced, quarries just don't have the equipment to do it, and therefore trying to find new high quality shale, like the old Breeden, people used to talk about Breeden shale, which was lovely. There was an Edinburgh shale, which was a very, very red colour. We had a couple of loads of that back a few years ago, and that used to bind together really well. But we've really struggled to find a decent supplier of shale, and trying to make it yourself, it just doesn't work. We get through 50 or 60 tons of shale a year, which just disappears. Some of it breaks down, a lot of it disappears as dust, a lot of it, the clay content, when it rains, gets washed away, and disappears down the drains and the like. So we get through a lot of material. And Gerald Ritter used to say, it's taken God millions of years to create this shale. How can you possibly think you can do it in 2 weeks? And he's got a point there. He's absolutely right there. But the Cardiff shale, as I say, it's got this springy feel to it. It just doesn't feel as if it will hold. It feels almost sort of too delicate, but it does hold. And partly that's the material, and partly that's the way that it's laid. As I say, you come in, you put a thin layer of about 2 or 3 millimetres down, and then you wet it, and then you put another layer down, another 2 millimetres, and then damp it down, and gradually you build and build and build and build and build. And so you've got that wonderful consistency from top to bottom, so that if the track is going to move, all of it will move. And that's why you get this kind of springy nature. So it's partly down to the technique and the technology behind laying the track, but I think it's also down to the fact that they've actually found some really, really nice shell. I'm not sure if it would work at Swindon, but I'd like to give it a try.
You can just borrow it for a week.
Well, yeah.
Make sure it works. Last question from Neil Phipps, who says, why do tracks sometimes change in condition so dramatically from practice to race night? I guess this is probably the same as what you were saying at the start about how things can change over the course of an evening, going from a grippy track to a slick track. Is that just atmospherics and conditions, or can tracks be changed to perhaps suit certain people, perhaps, if that, not that ever happens ever?
Oh, heaven forfend, no. If it was a temporary track, they've spent 4 days laying it. It then gets pounded to pieces. It then has to be rebuilt overnight. Now, at the end of practice, the Swindon track staff go out with our shovels and we begin shoveling all the shale from the boards. Now, sometimes towards the entrances of corners on the straights, you could have 18 inches, 24 inches of shale piled up against the fence. Now, that's all material that's been moved from where it was very carefully laid and feathered and watered and coiffured, or whatever you like to call it. Interesting that track curators in Poland are called cosmeticians. I can't wait to see Ronnie and Dixie wearing white coats and manicured nails. It's an interesting vision. But nevertheless, so you've got this enormous pounding. So we bring it back. Gunnar, who is the driver from Denmark who drives the blade, brings his big blade out, and then he starts to fashion it back down. But they don't have that much time then to put the track back again. The other things to take into account are, of course, that with Cardiff, the condition within the stadium on a Friday is very, very different from the conditions on the stadium when the Grand Prix starts, because you have the roof, which can be opened or closed. Well, it takes like 35 minutes to close the roof. So if you get caught in a rain shower, the straights are soaking wet, the corners stay dry. A recipe for disaster. So we tend to keep the roof closed, or if it's not closed, but just a little tiny gap. Suddenly you get 40,000 people coming in who are all breathing out moist air, and they're hot, and some of them may well be sweaty, I don't know. But nevertheless, you can actually feel the atmosphere change. You get an atmosphere change like that and the track changes. So, I mean, from my own point of view, having seen the beautiful way that the track looks on a Friday morning, and even after, in the last couple of years, we've had Ollie Allen and Kelvin Tatum doing the junior school racing out there. They have an hour on a Friday morning to go round and learn the skills, and it's brilliant to see these kids, little tiny mites coming up on their bikes and going out there, and proud parents and all the rest of it. That can be repaired because they're not really putting that much into the track itself, but the track looks so beautiful on a Friday before practice. And I've often thought, wouldn't it be lovely if it was this beautiful just before the Grand Prix actually started? And the only way you could do that would be by saying no practice.
It's been great and a fascinating insight into the life of a speedway track, both at Swindon and at Cardiff. Just one final thing left for you to do now, Graham, and that is for you to design your own dream meeting in our Speedway Paradise feature. So, got a few questions for you. And of course, the first question, very close to your heart. If you're going to be designing your dream meeting, Graham Cooke, which track would you choose as the perfect surface to race it on?
There are three tracks that I've been to that I would love to stage a meeting at. Cardiff, obviously, because of the surroundings, the stadium, the people, the atmosphere, etc., etc. Blunsdon, because, as I say, the new track, I think it surprised us very pleasantly with the way that it's behaved. But of all this, I still remember back going to Vetlanda, and I know that some of my friends aren't that keen on it. It's a big sandy track But the actual stadium, it's a bowl in the middle of a forest with grass banks, and people turn up with picnic chairs, and they spread out on these grass banks, and there's a huge pits complex, and it's a big wide track. So I loved Vetlanda. I thought it was absolutely it was magical. So I think I would stage my meeting at Vetlanda in Sweden.
Just as it is, the track and the surroundings there, it's perfect.
Yeah, I mean it was as I say, we were treated very, very well because we were friends of Lee Richardson. But I mean the whole thing, huge crowd for the meeting that we went to, spread out, whole families, lots and lots of children, going, and right the way through the age bracket. Suddenly the entire stadium goes quiet because there's a little girl on the centre green with a microphone who's singing the Swedish national anthem, and everybody in the stadium stands up and they're all singing it together. And then the meeting goes on, and then at the end of the meeting, rather than just disappearing, all the kids go round, and they were collecting up all the cans and all the litter, and the entire stadium was tidied and cleaned as the crowd went. And there was a real feeling of this was their community. They were so proud of the stadium, and they were so proud, and that they felt so strongly that we should appreciate how wonderful it was. And I've never seen anything like it. It really was quite moving.
Okay, Vetlanda then. It's I think that's the first time we've had a vote for Vetlanda, so you're breaking new ground there. Let's look at your all-time 1 to 7 then. This can be any rider from any era, alive or not with us anymore. No points limits or any small print like that. Who would you have?
Right, okay. Where do you start? Well, I'll start my number one, simply because he was my childhood idol, and I have met him in recent years. He wasn't always popular with the British crowds, but he was the number one. He was the captain for Wembley at one time in his career. So number one would be Ove Fundin. Hard man, but and controversial, but I'd have him in my team at number one. I'd pair him at number two, and this guy should be a heat leader, but I've put him in, and I've mentioned him several times this evening, Lee Richardson. That was the saddest moment that I can recall in Speedway when we lost Lee. He was the perfect gentleman, and I still treasure those times when he rode with Lee Adams in heats 13 and 15 for Swindon. You couldn't separate them. They were so close to each other. There was such trust, such control. And early on in the afternoon, when he used to bring his three lads out, little tiny tots, and they used to practice on the centre green, and we used to chat with him. So Lee would have to be in any team. Number three, because he was a mate and he used to make everybody laugh, I had Brian Carger. I never thought that we saw the best of Brian Carger. He was a skilled rider. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But he enjoyed himself, and he was fun, and he was good with the crowd. I never heard anybody say anything other than positive things about Brian Carger. So Brian Carger, a good bloke. And alongside him at number 4, fellow Danishman, again, child hero of mine from Wolverhampton, Ollie Olsen, simply because I've known Ollie. It feels as if I've known him all my life, really, and he's still a smashing bloke. Number 5, and now I have to start, where do you go to? Because, there are so many great riders that we could include. But again, somebody who I've grown to like enormously in the last couple of years, and I hope he does come back to Swindon sometime in the future, Toby Musalak. Great rider, but more important, a thoroughly decent chap, a really nice bloke to work with. He's had his moments. He's told me where to go on a few occasions when I've had to tap him on the shoulder and say, sorry, you touched the tape. But nevertheless, a really good bloke. And then my two reserves, one deserves it and the other one doesn't really. At number 6, I'd have Alf Busk, simply because Alf was our hero when we first went to Swindon, and he never gave up. And he may have come last lots and lots of times, but he was never badly trailed off, and we liked him for that. And number 7, and of course the captain of any team that I would pick, Rune Holta, no doubts. With people like Lee Adams, Phil Crump, Peter Narlin, Jimmy Nielsen, Jason Doyle, Martin Dixon from the time when Swindon went down a league, and we saw some of the best racing that we ever saw at Swindon in those years. Dicko, who had a testimonial when he was with Swindon, one of those riders who came to Swindon and you thought you'd never associated him with Swindon because he was a northern-based rider, but a great bloke who at the end of meetings used to drive all the way back up to Teesside to start work as I think he installed television aerials or something like that the following morning. It was astonishing. And he had a testimonial day, and part of the day was he invited fans to come along and ride their bicycles around the training track at Swindon. And so my son, my daughter and myself went up there, and there were a few other people who came along, and Dicko was there. He didn't have a bike. So I said, right, you have my bike, Martin. You need to sort of race with. So, all right. So we lined everybody up. And so there was my son David and then Martin Dixon right on the outside. And Dave rode him off the track on turn 1. And Dicko said, there's not many people do that and get away with it. But, I mean, just so many, really great. But I would go with Fundin, Richardson, Karga, Olsen, Musalak, Busk and Holter.
It's not a bad lineup, you have to say. Let's move on to the next facet of the meeting, your dream meeting, and that is the person who's going to oversee the rules, the referee. Now, I know that you are involved with referees a little bit because you are the assistant clerk of the course at Swindon. Without putting any noses out of joint, though, Graham, which referee would you choose for your dream meeting?
I'm not overly keen on some of the Polish referees that we've had at Cardiff. Where you have been left scratching your head wondering who or why came up with that decision that's just been made. I have to say, my favourite and somebody who I always look forward to when they come to Swindon is Christina Turnbull. She's great fun. She's a real character. She doesn't take any nonsense. But a meeting run by Christina is normally a happy meeting. So I'd have Christina as my referee every meeting. She has a nice touch with the riders. She's got a good sense of humour. She's she's as sharp as they can be. Nobody's going to get anything over Christina with regard to the rule book and all the rest of it. And as I say, meetings, when she's doing the meetings, they tend to be happy affairs. And she's also one of those people, and it's not that we seek this out, but it just means so much that at the end of a meeting when somebody comes up and says thank you, when you've been going for sort of 15 hours, and it's 10:30 in the evening, and it's been a really hard day, and you've gone straight from sort of 4:30, I take off the overalls and put on the assistant clerk of the course pits marshal kit, and then you run it throughout the evening, and you get to see a bit of the racing, but not much of it. I never actually see an entire race when I'm doing the job, because I'm always queuing up the next heat while one heat is running, or that there's always something to be done. But when you sink back into a chair in our little bolt hole number 96, and somebody pops their head around at the door and says, thanks for that, it means an enormous amount. And Christina is somebody who never fails to go around and acknowledge everybody's efforts. So good for you.
Nice. Christina Turnbull then, she's going to be looking forward to going back to the Abbey Stadium, I'm sure, when she can get back there. Hopefully to say thank you for that endorsement as well. The next section then in our dream meeting that we're looking at is the one rule you would change. If you could get your hands on that rule book, what's the one rule you'd change? You must maybe have one or two, being an assistant clerk of the course, that do your head in.
If the rule book were to be changed, that says, it is up to the referee in their understanding of the meeting and the circumstances of the meeting, if they feel it's appropriate to put on the 2-minute clock, then all riders must be at the tapes, not fiddling around 5 metres back from the tapes, but at the tapes, ready to race. Then frankly, what they do in that period in between really doesn't matter. I mean, the fact is, we've had circumstances where, there's been some sort of incident. There's been no exclusion, but then somebody has then been excluded because they didn't have time to sort themselves out before the next, and the delays just carry on. I think most people would accept 1 minute or 2 minute delay in between races. I think what Speedway fans will not accept is riders coming to the tapes who are not mentally, physically and mechanically ready to give their absolute all over the next 65, 70 seconds. And any kind of rule that means that a rider is discomforted in any one of those ways does the sport no favours whatsoever.
And Poland and certainly the GPs, they have the countdown clock by the tapes as well, don't they? And that's very much a countdown clock to the start of the heat.
Yeah, I mean, we have a countdown clock at Swindon. I mean, some people actually say that the countdown clock actually slows the meeting down a little bit because riders know exactly how much time they've got and they will use every moment possible. But it just makes life very, very easy for us. So we have a yellow flashing light in the pits which shows that the 2 minutes on. I can stand at the top of the pits. I can look down at the start gate. I can see 1 minute 15 seconds, and I'll then call it out to the rider or the riders in concern. You now have 1 minute, you have 45 seconds, you have 30 seconds. You better get a move on because you're going to be out. And it's absolutely clear and transparent. Every track should have a 2 minute clock. I'm sorry that so few actually do have.
One day they may catch up. Final question then. On your dream meeting, we need an opposition. Who is going to take on your all-time 1 to 7? This has to be an actual team that did exist once upon a time. But which would you go for, Graham?
Well, I wouldn't mind seeing that team that I've just chosen there up against one of the 2 Swindon teams that have won the league in recent years. I mean, I realise that Toby wouldn't be able to ride for both teams. So I guess we'd take Toby out and put Lee Adams in, and let's have the 1 to 7 from 2019. Jason Doyle, Adam Ellis, Toby, Rasmus Jensen. What an eye-opener that was when they signed him. Troy Batchelor, Ellis Perks and Klaus Wissing. Great bunch. Rasmus
Jensen is a reality TV star, isn't he, in Denmark?
Well, he could have been he was that in the UK. I don't know what he does in Denmark, but I mean the fact was that quite a few of us were left sort of scratching our heads with Rasmus who's Roscoe signed, and then we heard that oh my God, he's having to drive from Glasgow down to Swindon to make his debut, and then he turns up with Richard Huell, the old Wolverhampton and Newcastle rider, as his mechanic. And just blew us away. The man never knew when he was beaten. Real box office stuff. Tremendous signing.
Oh, yeah, he's a great rider. I've seen him a couple of times, and he's always exciting. I think he was on Love Island in Denmark or something like that. So right, okay. Yeah, he's well known in some parts. and in some people's DVD collections. I don't know who. Graham, it's been great chatting to you. Thanks for spending the time and giving us insight and all the things that you do, and a side of Speedway that is so important to everybody's enjoyment, but rarely gets spoken about too obviously. But it's been great, and hopefully, and I've learned something, and hopefully other people have as well.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
My thanks once again to Graham Cooke from the Swindon Robins track team for explaining a little bit about that mystery world of what goes on at the stadium when you're not there, which makes our experiences all the better. If you are new to Humans of Speedway, well, don't forget to subscribe to our feed on whatever platform you use to listen on, and that way, when we have a new episode, you'll get a little notification, more than likely, that tells you it's there, and you can listen at your leisure. There's also some great past episodes. If you've not checked them out yet, make sure you do, because there's some brilliant stuff in there, if I do say so myself. But if I'm not going to big it up, who else is? Gary Havelock is one of them. Kelvin Tatum, Jeremy Doncaster. Can you spot the theme? I'm basically just working my way through the England team in the early 90s. If you want more chat about Speedway Grand Prix, how about race director for the Speedway Grand Prix, Phil Morris? Lots more insight about the work that goes on preparing that, and so many more episodes as well. Just check them out at your leisure. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Humans of Speedway. Till then, take care.
Social Podcast Network.
Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this basketball season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projection for a wide variety of stats, and place your entry. It's as easy as that. If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with just a few taps. Easy gameplay, quick withdrawals, and injury insurance on your picks are what make Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Ready to test your skills? Join the Prize Picks community of more than 7 million players who have already signed up. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/get100 and use code GET100. That's code GET100 at prizepicks.com/get100. for a first deposit matchup to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy.